Welcome everybody. Dexter, can you please bring up the slide? All right, welcome everybody. This session is being recorded. This is PICHTR's Carbon Taxes, Credits, and Offsets, means for climate mitigation and adaptation. We are going to get started here in just a minute. We have an amazing lineup of speakers today. I am Veronica Rocha, and I'll introduce the rest of the speakers in just a minute. So we currently have about 23 participants, a lot more registered, so we're going to wait a few more minutes to get started. Actually, we'll just wait 1 minute to get started. Okay, we'll be back. Okay, Dexter, may I please ask for the next slide? Okay, welcome again, everybody, to today's session on carbon taxes, offsets, and credits. I am Veronica Rocha. I'm going to be your MC today. I also have Dexter Payne from PICHTR, who's going to be helping us with the IT. So to get us started, I'd like to ask all of those folks in the audience to do two things. The first thing being in the chat, if you can please use this function for comments and reactions throughout today's session, that would be excellent. And to get us started, if you can please introduce yourself, please enter into the chat where are you calling from and how did you hear about this webinar? Welcome, Joe. Welcome, Jeanette. Gideon, so nice to hear from you again. Julie, excellent. Well, keep introducing yourselves as we continue to go through today's session. Next in the Q&A, if you have any questions, I ask that you please use the Q&A function. This helps us to better keep track of all of the questions that are coming in from the audience. But in the meantime, let's get started with using it. Can you please enter any questions you are hoping will get answered by today's discussion? So if you can please enter that in the Q&A, that would be great. And please feel free to answer your questions throughout the entire session. We are going to leave about 15-20 minutes at the end for Q&A. But in the meantime, if something comes up as you're listening to one of the speakers, by all means, please enter your questions in the Q&A and we'll try to address as many as possible. Dexter, next slide, please. I would like to thank our sponsors and supporters, the Atherton Family Foundation, Hawaiian Electric, and the Consulate General of Japan in Honolulu. Next slide. For today's discussion, I'm going to do a quick introduction on PICHTR and its Climate Adaptation Collective program. I will then provide a very quick backdrop discussion, and that will be followed by panel presentations, and finally we'll end with a group discussion. Next slide. So first, a little bit about PICHTR's history and vision. PICHTR is a 501c3 nonprofit that was established in 1985 with a mission to expand economic opportunities in Hawaii by promoting public-private partnerships and advancing sustainable development. Next slide. The Climate Adaptation Collective is PICHTR's latest project. And its purpose is really to proactively tackle barriers to climate change adaptation by providing capacity building and advocacy to decision makers and the general public to enable forward progress on the most critical climate change adaptation initiatives of our time. It is also an opportunity for a more resilient and economically strong Hawaii by proactively addressing climate change. Today's webinar is part of our capacity building efforts to increase awareness and understanding of climate change adaptation challenges, solutions, and opportunities for Hawaii and abroad. Next slide. A quick of a backdrop on today's discussion. Now, it is very widely known that climate change threatens all aspects of society and natural environments. And this includes Hawaii, but certainly the rest of the world. So minimizing the impacts of climate change truly requires an all-in approach to greenhouse gas reductions and a parallel approach to climate change adaptation. In 2018, the Hawaii State Legislature passed Act 15, which established a net negative greenhouse gas emissions goal by the year 2045. Although Hawaii is a very small greenhouse gas emitter relative to global scale, on a per capita basis, Hawaii residents emit more than 2 times the global average of emissions. So today's discussion is going to be focused on what is the role of carbon taxes, credits, and offsets to reduce emissions and address climate change adaptation. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, we have an amazing lineup of speakers today. First, we're going to hear from Makena Coffman, PhD, who is a director for the Institute for Sustainability at UHERO Research. She's also a UHERO Research Fellow and Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Hawaii. She just has like an amazing background. I've known Makena for a number of years now. Her research interest is in climate change policy, including greenhouse gas mitigation, alternative transportation strategies, and climate adaptation. Next, we have Jonathan Marstaller. He is the president of Pono Pacific. He was born in Honolulu and raised in Maine. He returned in Hawaii in the year 2012 and began working for Pono Pacific as vice president of finance until he assumed the role of president in the year 2021. Jonathan holds a Bachelor of Science in Accounting and Business Administration from Gordon College, as well as a Master's in Accounting from Liberty University. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Makena, who is going to provide us a presentation on a couple of studies and reports that were done for Hawaii in terms of carbon taxes and credits. So Makena, turning it over to you.
Thank you, Veronica. Thanks for the introduction. And while I get my slides up, I just want to say, let's see, there we go. Thank you all for joining in today's conversation. It's nice to see the chat and the introductions and some. Okay, there we go. All right, so what I want to do, and I don't, it's a fast webinar, so I'm going to cover this rather quickly, but I want to cover 2 reports that myself and my colleagues did with this question of what are the economic and greenhouse gas impacts of a carbon tax for Hawaii. This has been a topic that's been introduced and debated within the state legislature for numerous years, and the first study was requested by the legislature in 2019 to answer this question. Are you seeing my slides correctly? Seeing the slides and not the visual? Yeah. Is it good? Okay.
Yeah.
And the second study was requested in follow-up by the State of Hawaii Tax Review Commission. So the backdrop context of this is Hawaii has very ambitious, extremely close to the science goals to be carbon net negative. Carbon neutral actually isn't quite the right words. Carbon net negative as soon as practicable and no later than 2045. And this bill was signed into law in 2018, and it was very much in response to the Trump administration running on the platform of pulling out of the United Nations Paris Agreement and that framework, the global framework for reducing emissions, at national and global scale. And so US states said, we are still in, and Hawaii was one of the states that joined the US Climate Alliance on this. and actually codified this into law. So the question is, what is the role of carbon pricing in actually meeting that objective, right? A little bit of greenhouse gas context. So this is from the State Department of Health's official greenhouse gas inventories. And I partner with ICF International to do this work where they do the inventories and we do the projected years. And I thought it'd be interesting to show everyone, you can see the years for which we have official inventories. 2007 was our highest emitting year. And since then we have reduced our emissions, but it's actually been relatively flat, with the exception of our estimate for 2020, which will be really interesting to do the actual numbers, right? Inventories are always a little bit lagged because of data needs. But most of our estimate for the dramatic reduction was a result of closures and air transportation. Although we do expect it to rebound a bit. And actually, we know that it's probably rebounded quite a bit, almost to pre-pandemic levels in 2021. But the expected reductions are really as a result of the state renewable portfolio standard and full realization of that goal, which of course has uncertainty in it, as well as expectations around federal corporate average fuel economy standards for cars and light trucks and energy efficiency within sectors. So the general motivation is, we know that national carbon pricing is actually the most effective, right? There have been so many studies that show that national level carbon pricing is really efficient. It can actually often be progressive. And what this means is that it relatively benefits lower income people, right? And that's actually a little bit counterintuitive. A lot of the popular notions about carbon pricing is that it is regressive, that it will relatively burden lower income people. But studies have shown that if done well, and there's a lot of detail here, that it can be quite progressive. And as well as a national carbon tax or carbon pricing structure can address issues of competitiveness amongst individual states and the nation, right, through border carbon tax adjustments. And states don't have that ability. So we certainly aren't arguing that a state level carbon price is an improvement over a national approach, but really without a national approach, how can states develop carbon pricing mechanisms to reach their own targets, contribute to the global reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, move the needle forward on national programs potentially, and what are the economic and greenhouse gas impacts? So as I said, this was a two-part inquiry, and the URLs are available here. These studies are entirely available online within the Hawaii State Energy Office website and within the State Tax Review Commission website. And I also want to acknowledge the project team. This was very much a team effort. Paul Bernstein, Maya Shervheim, Sumner LaCroix, and Sherilyn Hayashida all contributed in huge ways to these two studies. And this is how a carbon tax would sort of conceptually work, right? You would, in Hawaii, because we actually don't have any regional sources of fossil fuels, it's actually relatively straightforward in terms of capturing fossil fuels at the point of import, right? And you would put a price on the fossil fuels based on a ton of carbon that they pollute into the environment. And this would incent industries to, it increases the price of the polluting goods. It incents industries to search low greenhouse gas alternatives. It incents consumers to search out lower greenhouse gas alternatives. And ultimately you have greenhouse gas emissions falling. So we built what's called a computable general equilibrium model for Hawaii's economy. And I won't go into any details about the model. I will say that it's a very robust, comprehensive sectoral model. We are looking at 68 sectors and how they interact within flows of economic sectors, as well as greenhouse gas emissions throughout the Hawaii economy. We treat Hawaii as what's called a small open economy, meaning that it is a price taker on world markets. We have multiple sort of model calibration years, particularly in 2016, where we align the economic model with our greenhouse gas data and our greenhouse gas inventories. And we also do a sort of calibration solve in the year 2019. And this was the last year for which we had complete economic data before the pandemic, right? Before we had sort of strange economic years in 2020. And then we project the model forward between 2025 and 2045 in 5-year increments. And so these are really what's our forecasts and what we build our scenarios off of within this 20-year time period. And the projections are based on expectations around gross state product and visitor spending forecasts. And these are the gross state product. Because of the pandemic, we ended up incorporating multiple forecasts between DBED and UHERO, and the visitor spending forecast similarly, but it's mainly out of the DBED long range forecast assumptions. We also really wanted to be able to say something about how households and households by income group, because of this concern around how carbon pricing might affect lower income households, experience carbon taxation. We didn't have this data set specific to Hawaii. So we have within the state input-output tables, really, really good data about how the aggregate household in Hawaii spends money across sectors, right? Across these 68 sectors. But we wanted to then break that into household income groups. And we were able to follow a national study by Larry Goulder, who used National Consumer Expenditure Survey data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to break out this one representative Hawaii household into 5 representative households. So this was by groups of income quintile, right? So the lowest 20% of income households in comparison to the highest 20% of income households, for example, right? And so this let us anchor that analysis in Hawaii specific data, but the way the distribution was informed by national information. Important baseline assumptions into the model are around the current renewable portfolio standard that I said, has to date been the major driver of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. It requires that we reach 100% of net electricity sales from renewable sources by 2045. And the terminology net electricity sales is a little tricky. That does not represent renewable energy generation. And so using Hawaiian Electric's most up-to-date forecasts for rooftop solar is what really affects this calculation. We've estimated that effectively the RPS requires about 72% of renewable energy generation by 2045. And that's a binding assumption within the model. Next, we inform the model with things like how many electric vehicles do we sort of expect to be on the road in Hawaii as a result of corporate average fuel economy standards. And here we have just hugely varying forecasts of the future. We picked a few and analyzed how sensitive the model was to them. The one we ended up going with has 34% of electric vehicles are on the road by 2045. And really what this changes is our baseline emissions assumptions, but what we found when we really looked at how this assumption changed our outcomes, it really changes it. The scenarios don't change much, but the baseline changes a lot. And lastly, we look at the annual energy outlook for energy efficiency improvements in individual sectors. So I want to spend a bit of time explaining what we did in terms of the household income groups, because this is really what I think is most interesting about our results. So when we look at Hawaii's households and how they consume energy and greenhouse gas intensive goods and services, which is what the sectors that I have in bold here, you can see that it's the highest income households that consume the most, right? From a level value perspective, they consume the most petroleum, this is primarily gasoline into cars, right? The most electricity, the most gas, this is like synthetic gas and propane, water transportation, which includes recreational boating, air transportation, and ground services, right? So you can see that it's the highest income household that has the largest consumption of these energy intensive goods and services. But when we make it relative to the household spending itself, it's the lower income households that have a higher burden of that, right? So this is viewing the same information from a different perspective. It's saying relative to that household's average income, how much is the burden of these energy intensive goods and services? And you can see that it's now lower income households that have a higher burden relative to higher income households. Probably the most prominent places you can see this is in electricity, which is about almost 5% of the lowest income quintiles total household spending is in the electric sector, in contrast to 2% in the highest income household. And then in a flipped way, air transport is, still a relatively small share of total spending for a lower income household, and a proportionately much larger share for a higher income household. So this is our estimate of baseline greenhouse gas emissions. You can see that we expect future electric sector greenhouse gas emissions to decline. This is really assuming that the RPS comes to fruition with that generation constraint we put on. We would also expect to see a decline in ground transportation greenhouse gas emissions, and this has to do with our assumptions around electric vehicles and fuel efficiency, driven by fuel efficiency standards coming down from the national level. But we see an increase in air transport emissions, right? And this is really driven by our assumptions, or not our assumptions, our adopted assumptions from the long-range visitor spending forecasts for Hawaii. And when we layer on a carbon tax, we looked at two different price pathways. So this first price pathway, this, quote, $70 per metric ton, that's the last year number. This is representative of the federal social cost of carbon. So this is a federal number that's used to guide cost benefit analyses of federal projects. And the idea of the social cost of carbon is that it is the global damage cost of having one additional unit of greenhouse gas emissions out there in the world, right? So this is not a Hawaii specific number, nor should it be, right? Greenhouse gas emissions are a global pollutant, and so damages should be thought about globally, not specific to any region. And so, because, a greenhouse gas emission unit of greenhouse gas emissions in Hawaii does the same amount of damage as a unit of greenhouse gas emissions in Japan, right? For example, which is why it really does need to be this broad perspective. So this particular federal social cost of carbon, this was originally adopted in the Obama administration and then was reinstated within the Biden administration. There was a lot of talk about why this is probably an underestimate of global damages. So I think conceptually, it's definitely the right starting point. The criticisms of the way it was calculated are probably very valid. Criticisms center around, not incorporating uncertainty enough, right? Or not having a full damage function within the model, incorporating all sectors. And so when these things are better incorporated, the expectation is that this number will rise. But as a starting point, we took the Biden administration federal social cost of carbon, normalized into, this is normalized into 2020 dollars, and said, what if Hawaii adopted that? What would be the impact to greenhouse gas emissions in the economy? Okay, so that's this green line. So cumulatively, this reduces greenhouse gas emissions over the 2025 to 2045 time period by about 10%, right? So it is, it definitely works in the sense that we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This is, as I said, I think probably a conceptualization in the right way, but probably an underestimate of actual global damages. But, if we think about what is Hawaii's and anyone's contributions to global warming, it's not a bad starting point. However, it doesn't get us anywhere close to deep decarbonization, right? Which is why we looked at this second pathway, which was, it's not pinned to anything particular. It's not a federal number. This is just a big number, right? We said, what if we picked a much higher carbon tax pathway? How much closer to the carbon net negative goal by 2045 would it get us? We did not choose something that would get us all the way to zero, because the model doesn't fully incorporate backstop technologies like carbon offsets that Jonathan will talk about next. So the idea was to pick a number that got us really close, where you could start thinking about backstop technologies as filling that gap. And so with a carbon tax at a much higher level, reaching $1,000 per metric ton by 2045, we see a 70% cumulative reduction between 2025 and 2045. So, a much larger reduction immediately, as well as a pathway downwards. So this is much closer to the sort of climate science targets and what has been stated as necessary necessary for everybody in the world to do, right, in order to stave off the worst expectations of temperature increases. So economically, what do we see? And I know I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly because I'm running short on time. But economically, what we see is that it is, of course, a contractionary tax, right? It reduces total economic output, but it is pretty mild, like particularly the social cost of carbon estimate. By 2045, it's around 0.5% reduction than what we expect would have been otherwise without the tax intervention. The much higher price pathway, of course, has a much larger economic impact. And this should be interpreted in very much a kind of a worst case scenario, because this is assuming we're going it alone, right? This is assuming that none of our major trading partners have also implemented carbon taxes or increased their carbon taxes relative to the baseline. So economically, if our sort of regional partners also have carbon pricing, we're going to be better off, right? So that is part of the other goal, right? Is to see how do we form and encourage other people to have carbon pricing too, to ameliorate some of these effects. So you can interpret these results as kind of a worst case economic impact. And the social cost of carbon, as you see, it's really small. And again, you have to put this in context of what is assuming to be a growing baseline, right? So the social cost of carbon impact is incredibly small. And then with the much, much higher price pathway, it's not actually recessionary, right? It's just a contraction of growth. The most sort of interesting sector that are kind of that we put a lot of emphasis in the report on and did a lot of scenario analysis around ourselves to understand is the impact on visitor spending. And ultimately, the impact on visitor spending was really relatively small, because we know that visitor arrivals and spending tend to not be particularly price sensitive. So, and this is from years of other research done mainly by Carl Bonham and Peter Fulicki. So what we see is a very small reduction in visitor spending, 1/3% by 2045 in the social cost of carbon scenario, and 2.5% reduction in the much higher price pathway. Sorry, I didn't fully explain this. The difference between why we have 4 lines here is our assumption around what we do with those revenues, right? If we give revenues back to households, which is this dividend scenario, you see economic rebound. It's less of an impact when we give monies back to households. And if we keep monies or allocate monies towards existing government spending, it's a slightly worse effect, right? Basically, consumer spending will help the recovery, relatively speaking. We also find that as prices pass through consumer goods, that we're going to have a relative switch to electric vehicles, right? And so under the social cost of carbon, you'd see an 8 percentage point increase in the amount of electric vehicles on the road in comparison to all vehicles by the year 2045. And this is much, much larger, right? More than 50 percentage point increase in the really high price pathway, right? And this is because the price of gasoline hits almost $9 a gallon in this scenario. Going to household welfare impacts to wrap up, this is, I think, what I thought was most interesting about the analysis we did. And basically, how households fare depends, really, really widely or strongly on what happens to those revenues. So if you give back the monies in a dividend in this light purple scenario under the social cost of carbon, we actually find it's not just progressive, right? Meaning relatively benefiting lower income households more, but positive throughout. And this was really, this finding is driven by the fact that we have such a large visitor share that's paying into the carbon tax revenues when on a Hawaii vacation. So about 1/3 of carbon tax revenues are paid by visitors in the year 2045, right? And when then you have this dividend payment to households, it's an allocation of that monies to households, this is a little bit different than other national studies where they can find that it's quite progressive, but not necessarily positive for every household. We find it's progressive and positive for every household. It's small for the upper household income groups, but still positive. On the other hand, in the really high price scenario, even when because of the overall contractionary effect, that dominates relative to the dividend payments. And then when in either scenario, when monies are not allocated to households, when they're allocated to government spending, we see that household welfare declines. So this is kind of a general measure of household economic well-being, right? We did additional scenario analysis for the Tax Review Commission. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into this, but just if you want to, you can check this out in the report. We looked at the social cost of carbon scenarios and different allocations from households to government, sort of, whereas in the original report, we took the bookend approach saying all of it goes to government, or all of it that is available goes to households. And this, we split them up into 80-20 and also 50-50 shares. And in terms of what we would expect these payments to look like for households, under the social cost of carbon analysis, we would expect annual payments in equal shares to households to be between $850 to $1,100 annually. It changes, of course, with the year, with how much revenue is brought in, depending on the level of greenhouse gas emissions estimated. But this kind of gives a sense of the magnitude of the revenue payments. Key takeaways: a carbon tax and a dividend in Hawaii can be progressive. A very high carbon tax can, of course, result in overall welfare declines. And so we would want to meet Hawaii's goal of net negative emissions by, a combination of, of policies we pursue ourselves, as well as policies that we pursue more as a region and definitely as a nation, right? Because we're going to need new technologies for this to be cost effective, as well as national approaches are an improvement. And visitors pay into the carbon tax, and these revenues would be directly transferred to Hawaii's households, which is really what underlies our findings of the social cost of carbon, with dividends being not just progressive, but beneficial to Hawaii households. We also, in the Tax Review Commission report, do a lot of consideration around administrative considerations. So, the economic and greenhouse gas study was centered around the idea of a carbon tax, but actually the same economic and greenhouse gas impacts can be achieved either through a tax or through a cap and trade program. And that really is more of an administrative issue. Depending on how you set up the details, they can be quite similar. So we really dove into what would benefit Hawaii the most. And we concluded that a cap and trade program actually offered little additional benefit in comparison to a much simpler, cleaner to administer carbon tax, which we strongly recommended levying sort of at the highest point possible, right, at the point of imports of fossil fuels to the state. A cap and trade could be administered in combination with California and Quebec via the Western Climate Initiative. There are some benefits to doing this. There's, ability to link our markets to benefit from some of their lower price greenhouse gas abatement strategies. But it's a trade-off in terms of regulatory burden and needing to harmonize those market structures, as well as the markets aren't trading at the levels that we analyzed at the social cost of carbon. And last comment would be that issues around sectoral coverage also need to be further explored. For example, we made different assumptions about whether this could be extended to aviation transportation. There are limits about how aviation related tax revenues can be used, and we incorporated that into the model. But I think additional legal assessment of that is warranted. So with that, thank you so much, and I'll pass it to Jonathan.
Makena, thank you for such a rich discussion. Jonathan, it's all you.
Awesome, thanks, Makena and Veronica. Let's get over here. And we're open. I think we're good to go. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit of Pono Pacific's journey with carbon credits, carbon offsets. As was mentioned earlier, Jonathan Marstaller, the president of Pono Pacific, been working at the organization for about the past 10 years or so. But Pono Pacific was originally founded in 2000 and provides natural resource management as well as conservation work across the state. We work with a lot of large landowners, such as the state, federal government, Nature Conservancy, Kamehameha Schools, and whatnot. And we really have kind of on the ground presence on 6 islands right now, just doing a variety of activities to protect and maintain our watersheds and the native ecosystem that's here. As Pono Pacific has evolved, and I think what I kind of want to do through this is just take you a little bit on our journey of looking into offsets and credits. But as Pono Pacific has moved forward, we realize that a lot of the conservation and natural resource management work has been very grant funded or very cyclical in nature as to what's available out there. And so what we've wanted to do is explore other ways to have revenue or funding streams come in for us to be able to do more of the work that we've already been doing. And so that's where this initial premise of looking into carbon credits started. And in about 2016 or so, we started a sister company called Pono Island that's been looking into it and evaluating what it could be from like a small business or privatized side of it. One other note is that another sister company of ours is Kupu. So we do have a family of organizations here that are doing conservation activities or natural resource activities kind of across the state. And Kupu focuses on getting youth engaged in conservation and renewable energy. The next slide, this is just a broad base of, again, what Pono's done. One of the other areas that we focused on over the last few years is agriculture. So we've actually been managing about a 450-acre farm on the North Shore of Oahu, expanding from our conservation background and getting more into some of the ag field and taking some of our learnings and practices and trying to improve the land uses across the state. But in general, these are the scope of services we provide. Introduction into carbon offsets. So, just very basic. So different than, a carbon tax, which is trying to reduce the amount of emissions. Carbon sequestration or carbon offset is trying to capture more of those emissions through our natural environment. So, Pono Pacific has taken the approach of really looking into more of the forestry activities because that's more of our background. So looking at projects that would either, avoid deforestation or reforest certain areas across, across the state at different project sites. And so just as a definition, carbon offset is an instrument representing the reduction, avoidance, or sequestration of 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide. Just from a, overall scale, what we've been looking at, again, from kind of the private side is like, how big could this carbon offset market be overall? And so as you can see from 2005 to 2019, it's been on an upward trend. We're anticipating this trend to continue to go. And right now we're primarily looking at voluntary markets because there is no regulatory cap and trade policies or anything instituted here in Hawaii. So we've been primarily looking at the voluntary markets. So yeah, I guess just in continuing on our carbon project development or a little bit of our journey, some of the aspects that we've been going through is really trying to figure out how to create a valid and approved, I guess, project, on the ground project that's sequestering carbon that we could create, an offset for and be able to sell that offset. And so on the early end, the different project components, one of the main ones is validation, where there's an independent auditor that reviews the project document. There's registration, getting after the validation, registering that project, actually implementing the project, monitoring, the initial premise of that project, that forest growth rates and all that stuff is happening at the levels that were initially projected. Verification is a key step in the actual issuance of carbon credits. And then and then finally to issuance. So it does take a number of years. And, as I mentioned, we started this journey probably in 2016, 2017, and we're not necessarily close to the point of having an implemented project at this point. But there is kind of a long, or what we've experienced is a long road to actually get a carbon credit issued. On the next part, we'll just kind of highlight some of these in general, but these are some of the steps we've been going through. And so, one of the main ones is identifying that main project. As we, as Pono Pacific has multiple, I guess, a network of multiple large landowners across the state. We've been working with the state and a couple of private entities to evaluate if a carbon project could be viable on their property. And each one kind of depends on what the overall goals are and makeup is of that property. So, obviously, like creating kind of the front end clarification of what the goals are and expectations is one of the first things to start with. As mentioned, we've primarily been looking at that afforestation or reforestation type of project for the locations that we've been at. Step two is to conduct a review and assessment. And so, again, just getting more and more into detail of that specific project. I think one of the things I wanted to highlight on this slide is point, I think it's like 4 down, of additionality. So when we've been looking at projects, to create a valid carbon offset project, you need to be able to make the argument that the carbon wouldn't have been sequestered at the same rates without there being a carbon project implemented. So, with what Pono Pacific's been doing for a long time, the natural work of it has been sequestering carbon based on, just planting native species across the state or whatever else it may be. But a key component, again, is that additionality, where this work wouldn't have been done with the absence of a carbon project. Sorry, I think one other thing that's not on here as well, just from a basic kind of conservation management perspective, and I might get into it a little later too. But one of the challenges we've run into with it is, like, from a carbon accounting standpoint, there are certain projects where we look at, or the work that we do a lot of times removes invasive species from a certain project area, right? And then tries to reestablish native habitat. So in that process, we're actually removing the carbon stock from a specific site, which gets counted against the carbon that gets sequestered with the reintroduction of native species. So although it's positive for our ecosystem and our watersheds and all those pieces, it doesn't necessarily make for a really financially viable project. And so that's, like, in our evaluation, that's another challenge we've run into. One of the other pieces is to define the standard of use. These are various registries or standards that are out there. I think one of the components that isn't listed on here that's key to each one of these is that when you're looking at forestry projects, there's a different amount of a different time frame that the project needs to be committed into, for a carbon project. For instance, like Vera, I believe, is around 20 years, where some of the other ones move up to about 100 years to be committed in this manner. And if it gets converted out, there need to be, gets a little complex, but like a sale back of the credits that were sequestered. So this is I think a key piece as we're approaching various landowners, because they're, some of them don't want to necessarily lock up their land for an extended period of time. But depending on what standard is used, there's different timeframes associated with it. Step 4, defining roles and costs. So we haven't made it to this place because we haven't really got a project validated or registered yet. But down the line, as we build, these are the pieces that we look for. Obviously, define the roles and responsibilities between Pono Pacific and the landowner specifically. And I guess one other key piece in that landowner transaction too is that the greenhouse gas rates would be transferred from the landowner to this third party that can get credit for that, be able to register that carbon credit. So it is a little bit of a process with the landowners, and not something that is normalized in Hawaii as to what that lease or license or whatever that agreement would be to hand over the greenhouse gases that get sequestered. Step 5, financing. Once we get all those pieces together, there are some private or philanthropic partners that are available out there. But we believe that there's an opportunity to get some private investment into, or more private investment into this conservation, natural resource management side of things, and that's the area that we really want to kind of explore more, because there is a resource and there are opportunities through the public sector, but we believe that there's a way to activate. We haven't figured it out yet, but we believe we're trying to find a way to activate the private sector to continue to participate in this type of work. Next one, potential pilot sites. So I just wanted to kind of in closing highlight one of the areas that we've been vetting through. Back in 2016, I believe it was, through a RFP with the state, we've been working, got the rights to negotiate a project on the side of Mauna Kea, which is about 5,000 acres at Puumali, which is habitat for a native endangered bird over there. So the premise of the project would be to restore the native habitat and ecosystem for the Palila bird. And the state and Pono Pacific have been trying to find ways to finance that restoration project. We have, as I mentioned, it was back in 2016, so we haven't necessarily gotten to the end point of it, but a lot of these, we've had a lot of learnings along the way. And I think we've, from an experience standpoint, have run into various roadblocks that, that have kind of limited how far we can push it forward. But it is something that we're still diving into, we're still looking at, and trying to find a way to make carbon credits, carbon offsets, viable here in Hawaii. Yeah, I think that's all I have to share today, but we'll hand it back over to Veronica and look forward to any questions, and thanks for the time.
Thank you, Jonathan. Wow, what a rich discussion from both you and Makena, and so many great questions and comments and the Q&A and the chat. What I like to do is actually take some questions from the audience now. And Makena, I know that you've answered some of those questions, live, but I think that they're worth talking about a bit further. So this is from Lauren at Sierra Club, who said that she is, definitely thankful for the data that you provided, Makena, but she's still concerned that carbon pricing tax is putting the ownership on working class people, especially vulnerable rural communities, to change their behaviors. But in reality, nothing about the industry directly changes. They still get to extract oil and make money. Meanwhile, people who are already struggling in one of the highest cost of living with the lowest minimum wage pay more for everything, food, gas, utilities, and get a small amount back at the end of the year. So can you address this question, Makena?
Sure, it's a great question. No, thank you, Lauren, for it. And I mean, this is why we approached this study with the kind of technique we used, because it actually gets at both the consumer side and the producer side. So the tax is levied on the producer side, to be clear, right? And it is the burden is borne between both. It's not just borne total. There's not. It depends on the level of ability to pass through prices in each sector, right? Of how much it's borne to the consumer. And in the model, we're assuming perfectly competitive markets. And so in some ways, that's a worst case scenario in terms of price pass through, right? And I'm sorry, I feel like this is a little technical, but what I want to say is we're capturing both sides. And yes, you're absolutely right that if you just look at the consumer price side, the burden is on households. And in particular, we worry about the burden to lower income households, which is why we really tried to flesh out that data to show the impacts between household income types, right? But that's only one side of the equation. The other side for households is the income side, right? There's the consumer price side, then there's the income side. And once you put into the equation the transfers, which would be from the dividend payments, which we found to be incredibly important, right? And that was a little different than national studies, but also the income side that can come from return of capital and things like that. We actually do find that the pricing structure can be progressive. And as I said, what was different than national studies is that we actually found it's positive, right, across all household income groups. And that initially surprised us because that sort of stood out in comparison to other work. But the reason is because of the visitor spending patterns, right? That we actually have a third of our carbon tax revenues being paid by visitors because of the heavy tourism industry and the strength of that industry. So I totally appreciate the concern, and that's like why we devised this approach as we did. And I would have loved to be able to dig into more detailed household income groups, right? Like by quintile or something, like have 10 groups rather than 5. Because what we can say something is about the average household in each of those groups. That data just is not available from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is a limitation. But anyways, it's a strong consideration. And I think the finding that with the transfers, it's positive, I think gives a strong policy standpoint around the dividend.
Thank you for that, Makena. I will be sure, actually PICHTR will be sure to post Makena's slides, Jonathan's slides, today's webinar recording. So if anybody wants to dig a little bit deeper into these topics, they can. Jonathan, Makena, would you be open to people reaching out to you as well? There is a lot of content that was covered today, and certainly we just don't have enough time. There's so many great questions. The next question is actually for Jonathan. This is from Jeanette, who said, I have heard for years that there is an unmet demand for carbon credits to be issued from Hawaii projects, particularly from Hawaiian Airlines. Jonathan, is there in fact already this buyer and others from shippers, etc., in the wings?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, we believe that there are. Hawaiian Airlines as a part of, ICAO and Corsia, there's actually a global, or for airlines that are global, there's kind of a limitation as to what their net emissions would be that they signed up to be a part of. And so we have been talking to Hawaiian Airlines about being a potential buyer for credits once they're generated. One of the challenges, again, looking from a private sector, is that if you look at the price of a carbon offset for California, which has that cap and trade model, I think one metric ton of carbon over there is somewhere around $14 or $15, which is pretty high compared to the global voluntary markets that are out there. But what we found from a on the ground reforestation standpoint, the cost to actually generate that credit is much higher than $15 a ton. And so so yes, we think there's a buyer. I'm not sure if the price point is going to be able to facilitate or fully facilitate a carbon offset project here in Hawaii without other components to that project.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next question. Oh, Makena, please.
Can I just add to that? I think just to link what we're both doing, right? So if in the carbon, there is no reason for that a carbon tax, and we talk about this in the report, could not be extended to carbon offsets in Hawaii or anywhere else, right? That if we build the market through a tax mechanism, it's that you could include an offset component to meet that component of the tax burden. So that is a possibility of a way to fill that gap. It's more common in cap and trade markets, but there's no reason you couldn't do it in a tax market as well.
Great, thank you, Makena, for that clarification. The next question is for you, and I just want to talk a little bit more about the price of carbon. So you showed us a couple of scenarios, the $70 scenario, and then the $1,000 scenario, right? And it seemed like neither of them were necessarily what we needed, but perhaps somewhere in that range is the correct number. So my question to you is, well, what is that number and how do we reconcile that? Because we've seen year after year bills introduced in the legislature. There's in fact one right now, HB 2278, right? So what is that right, price that we should be looking at, and how do we move forward with appropriate policy?
Great question. I mean, so the what is that price is kind of the question that nobody can answer, right? It's there's different ways to conceptualize what it should be, right? The social cost of carbon is one way to conceptualize it. Just setting prices to meet your environmental targets, right? This pathway argument is just another way, and that's the way we conceptualize those two prices in the report. But there is no right number, right? There's going to be criticisms of either approach. And so I think what I take away is we know that we are not paying for our global environmental damages, and it's going to be to the detriment of ourselves and the world. And so any number that is not zero is an improvement, right? And so we need to start with that. Any number that's not zero is an improvement. And then you start getting into more complicated first mover regional approach kinds of backs and forths, which I think is interesting, right? I don't think it makes much sense for any individual state, right, to adopt a really, really hard carbon price without a regional approach. But it does make a lot of sense to adopt a carbon price akin to the social cost of carbon estimate that we used, because we showed that households can actually benefit from this, right? And then to use that as a platform for cooperation, to use that as a platform for getting offset markets off the ground, to use that as a platform to better harmonize to California and to grow that regional approach into a national approach, right? So I think, yeah, it's a little more complicated. And I do want to comment on the bill. So the bill, the numbers that are the carbon tax numbers embedded in the bill reflect are akin to this federal social cost of carbon. They've been adjusted to 2021 numbers and a nominal estimate, but they are based on that initial federal social cost of carbon.
Thank you, Makena. We're running out of time. It's so unfortunate because I feel like there's so much more to cover, but this last question is also on policy and it's for Jonathan. So Jonathan, from a policy, like a statewide policy perspective, what is needed to support carbon offset projects in Hawaii?
That's a terrible question for me. No, sorry. I mean, I think it's I think one of our challenges has been trying to do this strictly through a voluntary market. So without some type of regulatory driver within the space, it's going to be hard to accelerate getting down to net negative. And so I think, as Makena said, it's not necessarily. I think there needs to be a multi-pronged approach as to how we get there, and without the policy there to back that, time slipping by, right?
Understand, and of course, time is of the essence. Makena, any parting thoughts from you with regards to policy?
Only back to the bill. My understanding is that it made crossover and it is awaiting to be heard. So if people are interested in that, please, say your submit testimony.
Great, thank you so much. Dexter, can I please have you display the last slide? Dexter is going to be putting in the chat a survey on today's webinar. It helps us tremendously. If you can please take 3 minutes, that's how long it takes to complete the survey. to help us understand, how can we better serve you? What topics do you want to hear about? So please, take a few minutes to complete the survey. Well, this is a wrap for today. Really grateful for Jonathan's time, Makena's time. What a rich discussion, lots of engagement from the audience. I'm sorry that we were not able to get to every single question, every single comment, but please do reach out either to myself, folks at PICHTR, Jonathan or Makena. What's next? We are going to be providing to every single person that registered for this webinar a recording of today's session, as well as the slides are going to be up on PICHTR's website. Again, please complete the survey. And with that, thank you so much to everybody who participated today, Makena, Jonathan, Dexter, and everybody in the audience. Until next time, thank you.